New Level Cap Podcast is a show about fun, friends, game design, and all things otherwise. Your hosts are Marco DeSantos and Brad Telton of Level 99 Games. I'm Chris Solis, your producer, and without further ado, please enjoy the show.
Hey there, everybody. I'm your host, Brad Telton, also known as Not the Mechanic Critic, and I am here with my wonderful co-host from across the pond,
the Mechanic Critic, also known as Marco DeSantos. I now go by the Mechanic Critic in my daily life. That's what my partner calls me. That's what the doctor calls me. And
this could only be an improvement.
This can only, yeah. My original name is like 7 names long, so like at that point,
who wants to remember all that? I surely don't, Mechanic Critic.
Yeah, obviously, Brad. So
this name sounds a lot more like a superhero name, anyway.
Oh my gosh, it's totally true. I could fix critics.
Look, it's the Mechanic Critic.
Fear not, citizen. I am here to criticize you on how well you're doing with your mechanics. Your foot is not angled properly, giving you bad foot disease. Mechanic Critic away, and that's it.
That's truly something.
Yeah.
Well, tell me what our topic is going to be about today, Marco.
Well, who's Marco? No, but seriously. So, Brad, this actually came as a suggestion from one of our listeners. I believe it was Twilight. If I'm wrong and it's not Twilight, I'm sorry. But they were asking something along the lines of reads versus logic. This is a very important thing and something very close to all of us at Level 99 Games, considering that 2 of our really popular games are fighting game, card game simulator type games. And reads versus logic.
And we're kind of known as the guys of competitive battle card games. So it makes sense that we would talk about this kind of thing. So I think it's right in our wheelhouse, and I think it's a great topic. Reads versus logic.
So, Brad, what are reads versus logic? Why are we talking about this? This is about reading books versus making logical conclusions?
Very much, except the books are your opponents, and the logical conclusions are the mathematically superior plays in a card game. So, to make this clear, you have multiple choices, multiple strategies that you can play in a game. Each of these strategies, they have some odds of success, some odds of failure. Your opponent likewise has strategies, some odds of success, some odds of failure, and often these two are integrated. If I pick strategy A and you pick strategy B, there's some kind of outcome, vice versa, right?
Yep.
So it reasons that in a game where not all the strategies are created equal, there is going to be some strategy that is mathematically optimal for you to play. It is the highest chance of success or the lowest chance of failure based on what your opponent's play could be that has the highest chance of success and the lowest chance of failure. Mm-hmm. And their play is going to be based on yours, and that cycle can go round and round. You can get very, very refined with the numbers. There's a certain point it doesn't matter too much anymore in most games. But you'll come up to a point where at any given moment there is a mathematically optimal play to make that nets you the highest success and lowest failure based on what you think your opponent's going to play.
Yeah.
That's the logic side, right? And so when we say we're playing logically, we're playing the mathematically sound way. We're playing by the numbers. And when we play, and if you don't play that way, there's two sides to that. If you're not playing by the numbers, you're either bad or you're playing against the player.
Yep.
Right. So just because card strategy A has the highest chance of success, that doesn't mean that you are going to play one of the moves that loses to A. You might anticipate my A and play B, and then if I sense that you sense that I might play A, I immediately need to play C and beat your A.
That's the Yomi, so to speak.
Right. That's what David Sirlin calls Yomi. And what we'd say in English is called reading. Yomi is Japanese for reading.
Yes.
So this is a term that originated in the arcades in Japan, but it makes a lot of sense in card games as well, that especially simultaneous selection games, where if I anticipate what you do, I might want to play the read instead of going for a pure logical play.
It makes sense.
Yeah. It makes sense, and it kind of boils down to what I was saying in an earlier episode, where all games ultimately come down to this question of playing perfectly reasonably or playing against the player and playing with intuition,
Mhm.
And so you're really looking for, this dichotomy between intuition and pure science.
Yeah.
And that's what the whole thing boils down to.
It's very interesting because like at the end of the day, the logic player will reason that if this move has an 80% success chance, I will basically almost always play it. And even if 20% of the time I lose, 80% of the time I win anyway. But the reads player goes at that and goes, this thing is 80% successful, which means if I play the move that beats it, I will win 80% of the time. It's essentially what they're doing, right? And this kind of back and forth is very emblematic of a lot of the games that we've released, and especially games like BattleCon and Exceed, where, again, like you said, simultaneous selection is really, really important. So, Brad, why are we talking about this? Why is that important?
Yeah, so this is the fundamental strategy of all of these kind of strategy games, and they are. I guess we'd say like a subset of economic games. Like you would see these kind of problems come up in game theory. And essentially the matrices that exist within games like Exceed and BattleCon are going to be the same kinds of problems you see in a game theory class, except that they're at a higher level with more levels of indirection.
Mhm.
But all of these problems kind of reduce down to either a solution or an equilibrium. A solution is where I can discover a strategy that simply wins, right?
Yep.
And if a solution exists, then you logically want to play the solution. An equilibrium is where a solution doesn't exist because both sides have different strategies to play, right?
Mhm.
A game like BattleCon, where both players have full information and full access to all of their strategies, this is a game that is purely about reads. You reach the logic cap very quickly because all information is on the table. I don't have to wonder, what cards you might have, what cards you might not have. Maybe there's some strategies, whatnot. It's really, these are the 8 things you might play. These are the 8 things I might play. I know how they interact. I just have to figure out what it is that you're going to play and counterplay against that. Figure out what my counterplay is, and then see how many levels deep I want to follow that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess
Whereas,
like one thing to point out though is that even in a game like BattleCon, right? Even if you've reached the logic cap, there's still like players who stick to the pure logic where they go, okay, so I know all 8 options, but one of my options beats 5 out of those 8 options that my opponent can play. So even I don't care about going 17 levels deep. No, I'm playing this thing that beats 5 out of 8 of your attacks, and I'll just basically go, I have a 5 in 8 chance of winning, right? Like
You'll hope that they don't see it, or hope that they anticipate that you're going to play one of the other things in
exactly
your kit.
and that's a way that some people in BattleCon would say that they are logic players, wherein rather than attempt all of this reading stuff, they just math out, hey, this one has the highest percentage chance of winning, and let's just do that instead.
And it's a great way to play, but it's actually a better way to play a game like Exceed or Poker, where you don't have full information and where your opponent doesn't have the full range of strategies available.
Oh, for sure.
In a game like that, where there may be strategies unavailable to my opponent, or they may not have decisions, or their strategy may be locked, like in Poker, then you want to play purely logically because the opponent can't counterplay you.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's really more of a game to play by the numbers. Whereas the game like BattleCon, where we do have full information, the reading play is the only way to ultimately come out ahead. Because with any 2 players meet, there's going to be kind of a foregone conclusion. If we both play our logically best attacks, the outcome is already set.
Yeah.
If I play my best move, you play your best move, one of those is going to win. And so unless we think about what the opponent is capable of, then we're not going to get very far unless we just pick the mathematically superior character in the cast.
Yeah.
Which is maybe non-trivial to prove, given that there's 100 squared matchups in BattleCon.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think the big thing to point out here is that in a game like BattleCon, ultimately, the logic play really works if you're fighting against people who are not of equal skill level to you. Like, if you're fighting against players who are weaker, if you just play completely logically, that's how they basically get destroyed every single time. And
I would say it's not too easy to reach the logic cap in BattleCon. As a human thinking, it's very easy to miss things in that game.
Yeah.
And so having the presence of mind to to see everything is a huge skill leap all in itself.
Yeah.
But once you reach that, then the reads come into play, and then it's a whole new game.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
It makes it fun. Hey, can we do a little case study for the people who might still not understand what the heck we're talking about? Let's talk about Exceed. It's a game that I feel like this kind of conversation would easily more revolve around. You did say that logic play tends to work really well in games without full information. So let's talk about the most logical play in Exceed. Have you ever seen the sweep normal, Brad? Well, of course you have. You designed it.
Of course.
And
right. Sweep is the best normal, as we all know. It does 6 damage. It kills a card in your opponent's hand. It hits range 1 to 3. It's got a ton of guard. No other normal can pierce through it, except for Spike. So at range 2 and 3, maybe your opponent plays Spike, which is super unsafe. At range 1, it's totally safe, and you always get it off.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing that
there's really no risk
actually beats it is Cross, right? And all
at range 1, yeah.
Yeah, and all Cross really does is get you. It only deals 3 damage, right? So the worst thing that can happen to you is that you take 3 damage and whoop-de-doo, you lost the strike.
If you're at range 1 and you've got a sweep, you probably ought to play it.
You mash it.
You probably ought to play it. Yeah.
Yeah, you auto play it and you ought to play it, right? It's just that good at that point. And here's the thing. Sweep gets even better if you have the correct positioning. If your opponent is literally in the corner and you sweep them, there's no way they can. There's no way of even beating it, right? The spike won't hit, the cross won't even get out of the way, so literally nothing can beat sweep. To the logic player, sweep is the holy grail. It's a godsend, right? They can go, oh man, this thing just mathematically wins 80% of all the possible situations in the game, so I might as well play it. But you did already mention another normal back there, a little normal we call Spike. What does Spike do exactly, Brad?
So Spike ignores guard, so it's got a guard piercing property on it. And so even if you hit your opponent first with a Spike, they won't be able to retaliate pretty much no matter what. There are a few cards that break it, but that break that rule. But generally, if this is a card that you would only play if you predict your opponent is gonna use a powerful defensive card because it's not quick. It's got good damage, but it doesn't really have any way to guarantee that damage. It's easy to dodge if anybody gets any movement in. So it's a really unsafe attack. And it is kind of like sweep is the definitional logic attack. You might say spike is your definitional read attack. It's your hard read. It works in this specific situation. And when I see that move coming, if I can land the spike, I can do a hard counter and get a huge payoff.
Yep. And if you really think about it, this is where that relationship between the logics and the reads come in, right? Because I feel like Spike and Sweep both exemplify how those two paradigms of playstyles clash with each other. The Sweep players always go man, I'll just play the safe attack all the time. But the Spike players go ha, that's exactly what I want you to do. Because if you try to sweep against a Spike, 9 times out of 10, the sweep will lose against the spike, right? Especially
always. I mean, always if the positioning is set up for
exactly.
It.
That's why
that's the thing about Exceed is that when two cards meet, the outcome is determined in advance, and you have a lot of information about positioning. The real question for the logic player is, there's 30 cards in this deck. My opponent has 6 of them in his hand. And so there's 2 in 30, 12 in 30 chance that they've got this spike or something like that. My math is probably not right, but there's some chance that they've got this spike. And I'm at range 2, and I have the sweep. Am I ready to commit to the odds? And when you look at that and you say, well, yes, this is an obvious smart move to commit to these odds, you play your sweep anyway without fear. And maybe you get spiked, maybe you don't, but you know that you made the mathematically right choice in that case, right? And if if I'm at range 2 and I see that you're playing an attack against me, and I have the spike in hand, I think, well, it's pretty likely he's got that sweep. There's a chance that he doesn't, but I think I see that on the table, and I'm going to try and read into that with my spike. You can make that read. But that's playing by the numbers. If let's say you were at range 2 and you had that sweep in your hand and you instead play the assault, right, which is like dive in and hit for less damage, but it beats a spike. Yeah, it beats a spike. That would be the read, right?
Yeah.
So I think in both these cases, the spike player and sweep player are playing logically, but the player who plays the assault instead of the sweep, even when sweep is optimal, that's the read. And those are the kind of plays that really shift the outcome of the game.
Oh, for sure. I mean, range 2 spike on offense and exceed is like probably the dumbest thing you could ever do. But it works. It just.
But it's good on defense. Yeah, you could. Range 2 assault on offense is pretty bad too.
Yeah, like all of these. So plays that seem completely horrible, but then because they kind of silver bullet are really good and safely consistent option, that tends to be the reader player's arsenal, right? Like the reader player is basically comprised of a bunch of silver bullets that if they get a silver bullet right against you, you eat it. You eat dirt, basically. And
yeah,
it's very, very interesting because it's really, to me, I guess, it's a question of consistency versus payoff, right? The read-based player doesn't really get a lot of payoffs, but if it happens, they win the equivalent of like 2 to 3 turns, right? But
generally, if your system is well designed, like if the payoff is proper, right, you have to like there's a certain logic to playing the right read too, because if your payoff is not worth it, even a hit will not cover the amount of risk you took on, right?
Exactly.
Like if I stand to lose everything, and but I might not lose everything if I make this read, but I would lose everything if I make it incorrectly. I can only afford to take that chance so many times, right? Like I need to be able to, what's the word? Punish my opponent's mistakes, or punish my opponent's misreads in a way that does not prevent them from actually, taking those gambles. So it's a delicate balance.
For sure.
Right?
I don't think anybody actually plays completely only logically or completely only reads based, right? Because there's like a point wherein both of those ideals kind of like merge together.
Well, you can, and in a lot of cases you should. Are you familiar with the term on tilt or tilted?
Yeah, sure. It's when you get very frustrated when you're playing and you start making completely illogical moves because you're frustrated.
That's kind of the like, I guess you'd say the
fighting game version of it.
Not even the fighting game version, just the casual definition, the colloquial definition of it.
Oh wow! Did you just call me a filthy casual, Brad?
I didn't say filthy. I just said casual.
All right. Okay.
But it's a term used in poker, and what it means is, poker players know all the odds of every hand. And when you make a play that is not supported by your understanding of the statistics, that's called tilting, right? And so when your opponents aren't playing by the numbers, you'd say they're on tilt, and that's a good time to make some money from them, because it's very hard to win against the numbers in poker because you don't have strategic control.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess it makes sense, right? Yeah. Like for some games, but I do think in games like BattleCON and Exceed, I guess there just comes a point, right? Like you said, we were mentioning earlier that there you reach some sort of logic cap, right? Where at that point you have to start making reads, or else you're going to lose to somebody of equal skill, right? Because if they make reads and you don't, you're going to lose.
It depends. Well, what I'm saying is that it does depend heavily on the balance of the game and the situation. There are times when you can make a read and you can win, but it was not proper play to make a read. And that's in that it was not appropriate play to make a read.
Yeah.
Even if it turns out better for you, even if you were right.
Yeah. So even if you succeeded, so to speak, it wasn't the correct play. So it's kind of like you did math wrong, but ended up with the right answer, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think that may be like kind of the pure heart of Yomi that we talk about when we think about this term. What we really think about is a player who is willing to make a play that's hugely risky, maybe even inordinately risky for himself, because he has understood innately what the opponent is going to do.
Yes.
And that's where we would say what we would call like the hard reads. But there's a level of prediction that is lower than that.
I think this is the point that I'm trying to make, I guess, is that ultimately I don't think anybody should play pure Heart of the Yomi, Heart of the Cards, right? Because I feel like that is often the incorrect move, because even if you have the pure hard read on the opponent, taking a few seconds to logically think out whether or not the hard read is correct to play is still good practice, right? It's still something that will help you win the game. And I feel like you said, right, if you only go by pure logic and at that point you fight against somebody who does make good reads, then you're not going to win against them either. So I guess my point is that in our games, at least, since we've probably balanced them properly, you have to kind of play with both. There's no such thing as doing only one or the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You have to have, and it's the logic fundamental that enables reading.
Exactly.
That's a big takeaway. If you don't understand the odds that your opponent is going to play a card, you can't really make reads. You have to understand their reward structure and they have to understand your reward structure, and then we can start to see the manipulations that exist within that structure to outplay the opponent. But let's take a quick break, and then we can come back and talk a little bit more about how these concepts, these high-level concepts, come into a design and how we build in this kind of economic structure in our own games.
Spicy. All right, let's go to a break, and hopefully you read through it. Wink?
The biggest fighting game event in the world, EVO 2019, is coming soon. Come play some Street Fighter Exceed in the vendor hall. Meet new players. Test your might against level 99 game staff, and grab a free Ken vs. Ryu demo deck while supplies last. We look forward to seeing you there.
Let's dive back into the episode, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed that little advertisement break. Hopefully you enjoyed listening to the dulcet tones of one Kanashimi. Brad, is that how you pronounce it?
That's not what I have on her employment records. So
No?
I'm not going to attempt anything else without her permission. You just have to ask her to pronounce it.
Okay, great. Let's ask her next time to do it. Anyway,
okay,
Brad, we talked about in the earlier part of the episode about reads and about logic, how essentially they have influenced our design for our fighting game card games, and maybe how that is concretized, or some examples and case studies, so that listeners can further understand our point. But Brad, ultimately, why is this so important? This is a game design podcast, so why are we talking about stuff for players? Stuff that players do all the time, which is to read and make logical conclusions. Why is this so important?
Well, of course, you have to understand how players are going to play when you are building your game, right? And these concepts are sort of fundamental game theory concepts, what we would call the matrix of the decision matrix of a game, which is all the different strategies one player might play and another player might play, and how they interlace with each other. And when these strategies interlace together, you reach points called equilibriums,
mm-hmm.
right? You might have a local equilibrium, you might have the equilibrium for the entire chart. And that's more what we try to achieve when we build the normal matrices in games like Exceed and BattleCON. But the equilibriums here are where no card is the right move all the time, right? There are some cards that are right moves more often than others. And there's some cards that are useful less often than others, but nothing is always right. Nothing is always wrong to play. And that leads to a situation where all of your strategies are viable in at least some cases.
Mm-hmm.
And where you can set up strategies to make certain payouts. Understanding that you can start to understanding that you need to have this logical foundation, then you can start to build all of your different abilities so that they interlace in this way. And the reason that we've used the normals in Exceed and the standard bases in BattleCON is because having both players with the same foundation is a lot easier than building a different matrix for every single matchup in the game.
Oh gosh,
that's very hard.
Yeah,
it's very hard. Even for computers, it can be very hard. All that comes together, and that matrix really informs the way that players perceive the game. What plays are viable? what plays are non-viable, and in what situations those plays are viable.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been playing a lot of Exceed recently because of testing, and one of our players has really taken a liking to Carl, the promo from Penny Arcade's Automata, right? And he really likes him because Carl has a range 1 spike. So it covers the quote-unquote blind...
The hole in spike, yeah.
Yeah. So he has a range 1 spike, and he really likes that because it really affects the way the Matrix works. Sweep is no longer absolutely safe at range 1 all the time. And suddenly that changes the entire dynamic of the game. And that's just one example, right? That's just one card in a character's, 16-card kit.
Mm-hmm. I guess what we'd say, the foundations are what we'd call dominant strategies. At a certain range, at a certain time, a certain card is the best card to play, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there is another card. If there is another card that beats it, and then there is another card that beats that, we reach an equilibrium. This kind of dynamic circle where either of us could play A or B. I could play A or C. You could play B or D. And that's going to determine the outcome of the round. So we have this equilibrium. The read is what you might call a mutant strategy. It's something that comes kind of out of left field that only beats the specific counterplay that you're going to do. That is what some very specific cards can do. Mm-hmm. But if one strategy becomes too dominant, then these mutant strategies are a viable alternative. Become suddenly a viable alternative. That's the textbook game theory definition of it.
Do we have
what it means?
Actual game,
Yeah,
examples?
What it means in actual gameplay is that if weenies get too good, suddenly cheap kill spells are actually a valid strategy to victory. But only in the meta. You're basically talking about localized metagame at this point, right? Yeah. Once the certain strategies become dominant, then I can start to really make these smaller strategies, these reads that will upset the balance.
It's kind of like in Hearthstone, where if there's a deck that's dominating and it wins based on having a specific weapon equipped, and you just put in 5 cards that say destroy the opponent's weapon, that's kind of it, right? Suddenly these cards that seem really bad, that don't usually do much in most other matchups, if the weapon-based deck becomes so dominant, then suddenly that weird weapon destruction deck that didn't work before and was completely non-viable is suddenly one of the quote-unquote valuable strategies left in the metagame, right?
Right, yeah. So any dominant strategy creates these in a good game ecosystem will innately create these mutant strategies that are effective against it. Yep. If your game is healthy. When you don't have that counterplay in the game's ecosystem, then one deck just dominates and it becomes monotone, right? And you probably imagine, if you've played any number of collectible card games, you've probably encountered this kind of meta stagnation before. It certainly happens in Magic Vintage. So where Tendrils is I think basically the turn one kill decks. There's 2 or 3 of them, and there's really no play against it.
And really, it's just picking different flavors of the same deck, right? Even if there's 3 turn 1 kill decks, they all just do the exact same thing, and there's no counterplay, so they might as well all be the same deck, right?
So we're really talking, when we build a game, about this local metagame. What could I play? What could my opponent play? How are those two going to interact? And what kind of tools can I give the player so that they can discover mutant strategies that will break the meta they create?
Yeah.
And in fighting games, we might call this training. There's some relationships to this concept where I walk up and I throw you once, and then I walk up and I throw you again, and then
will I do it a third time?
I'm going to do it a third time, but so you get ready to do a tech, but instead I walk up and I wait for you to tech, and then while you're teched, I punch you or something.
Yeah.
Right. And because I have trained you to do a certain thing, and then I am reading that you're going to follow my training.
Yeah. Oh, I call that
maybe
conditioning.
We're getting off into tangents.
That's interesting. I call that
conditioning. That's training, conditioning. I prefer to go by both.
Oh, that's interesting. But we're going on a tangent, right? Ultimately,
we are.
I mean, it's okay. This podcast would be not itself if it were not for tangents. But ultimately, the point that we're making here is that we're talking about reads and logic, because it's not really about reads and logic. This entire episode is not actually about those two topics. It's actually about what those two topics represent, right? It's about understanding what kinds of strategies are dominant or positive or useful in your game, and understanding how that can create a sort of matrix where other people have to respond to that strategy. Can your players respond to that strategy? Is there a way to beat it, even if that way of beating it is not the optimal way to do so, or not the optimal play in every situation? These kinds of things apply to every game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, every game that has that dynamic circle, those equilibrium at its foundation, will exhibit this behavior.
Yes.
Right. And the thing I think I really want you to take away from this, if you're listening, is that even your reads are not, pure from the heart. Let me play the top card of my deck without looking. It's really about making your reads with logic.
Yep.
So you have to be willing to to do that, to have that foundation, to find those equilibriums before you can exploit them.
I think that's really, as a Dan main in Street Fighter Exceed, this is basically the entire game, right? This is basically my entire playstyle. Dan, for people who've never played Exceed before, is a character who uses wild swings, which means that when he attacks, he gains benefits if he chooses to essentially attack with the top card of his deck. So he doesn't know what it is.
Without looking, yeah.
Yeah, without looking.
So you're really thinking entirely about what the opponent's play is. And then what are the odds that I'm going to get the counterplay on top of my deck, or just a stronger play on top of my deck?
Exactly.
And you have some ways to hedge that bet, but mostly you have to play by the numbers. Dan is actually a character that can't read because you don't know what card you're going to play.
So essentially, as ironic as it seems, Dan is basically a purely logic.
A pure logic character.
He's a pure logic character, which is completely ironic to many people, but it's true, right? Because Dan can't. If Dan reads what the opponent's doing, usually 9 times out of 10, Dan can't do anything about it because his hand is empty. So he has to essentially just play the top card of his deck and hope it works out.
Yeah,
but really, that's
you're evaluating the top card of your deck, the theoretical top card of your deck, against the theoretical card your opponent's going to play.
Yeah, and I think that might shake some things up for a bit, right? Because Dan is not a character about reading, and in that sense, people often associate randomness and uncontrollability with, oh, that's not logic play at all, right? Like if it's random and I can't control it, that's not logic play at all. But when in reality, the perfect game for logic-based players to just know every single card of their deck, and Dan wins every game if he just knows every single card in his deck, right? And ultimately, I think that's one really cool thing about understanding how all of this works. And Brad, we haven't even talked about the card that I think is kind of both these things.
Mm-hmm.
Have we talked about reading yet?
So we haven't talked about the actual boost reading in Exceed. This is a card where you name a card in your opponent's hand. If they have it, they have to play it. If they don't, they show you your hand. But before they show you your hand, you or set that card, you have to set your own attack. So I set my attack, and then I call what I want you to play. And you either play it or you show me your hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is really I would say a play that you can make. You can do the hard read with this card. You can say, I think you've got this thing that is not viable in this situation, and I'm going to call for it, and I'm going to try and beat it. Or you can play purely by the numbers. You say, based on the position you're in, I think you have this card in hand. I think you would play it. I'm going to guarantee that you play it, and then I'm going to do the hard counter. And so you can play it risky, or you can play it safe. And it's a card that really does exemplify that dichotomy.
Yeah. Well, ironically, since it's called reading, it's not actually just a purely reading-based effect. It's actually an avenue for both types of players to...
Well, that's what we've said. All reading is grounded in logic.
It's true. It's completely true. Oh my gosh. So Brad, we've talked about how we've further explored how reading and logic affects your gameplay, how it affects your design, and the underlying game theory mechanics behind why reading and logic even exist in our games. Brad, when we design cards, do you design cards to cater to a certain playstyle? Is that something you consciously do to lead people towards, hey, maybe you should do reading, maybe you should do some logic? For example, does reading the boost card, the boost effect, does that exist because you know that players should do it? You know what I mean? Like, Are you trying to guide players towards this line of play, and that's why you've put cards like Reading, Spike, and Sweep into the game?
Well, it's a little. I mean, to be a bit poetic about it, it's all tangled up, right? Like, part of Reading is this is a nice feature that players can use. Part of it is that it punishes you from relying too heavily on the normals, because once your opponent once you keep a hand of normals, you're vulnerable. Part of it is that it is a way to force through certain plays that might otherwise be very risky. Say in 7th Cross Exceed, you have to hit with some of these
specials that have transforms on them.
Yeah, so with some of your transformations, and Reading is a great way to force through a transformation if you need to.
Yep.
So it's a robust tool, and when I design a game like a card game, I'm really thinking about how all of these tools are going to translate into a complete player experience. I'm not really thinking too much about, well, I've got to hit points A, B, C, D on the matrix. The matrix is something you can use to sort of check your work, but it's not really great as a starting point. And when you build your game with the matrix as the starting point and not the end point, you kind of end up with games that feel a lot drier and a lot more mathematical. Games where the like pure structure doesn't have a lot of flexibility in it.
Ooh, now we're getting to the quote unquote pitfall that I was alluding to.
Yeah, so it's as you're designing a game, at least for me, and my philosophy of it is that I want to deliver a certain kind of experience to the player. I'm going to give a selection of cards that is going to bring that experience to life, but that also within that set of tools exists play and counterplay and counterplay. And once you have all those three things set, the matrix will kind of naturally, you can know that it will exist even if you don't write the whole thing out on paper and test every combination.
Yeah.
But if you start with, hey, I've got to make sure that, rock beats paper and paper beats scissors, or sorry, I did that backwards, but, rock beats scissors and scissors beat paper and paper beats rock, and I have an equal number of each of these activities in my deck so that I'm fairly balanced against my opponent. When you get to that point, the game can lose a lot of the personality that the character is supposed to bring to life. It's really best when, rock is 10 times as good as scissors, which is like 3 times as good as paper. But when you play paper, you get to, draw 3 cards. Those are the kind of, dynamic circles that make for interesting play.
Yeah, because otherwise you turn into chess, right? And
you turn into
rock, paper, scissors, I guess.
It turns into rock, paper, scissors. But really, you kind of want to be able to, once you have that good rock, paper, scissors circle, your characters need to be, the Spock and the lizard and the dynamite, all the other things that you want to rope back into this core.
Yeah.
So your mutant strategies, if you will.
One thing that I want to call back in a previous episode we've done? It's very important to remember that the game serves people and balance serves the game. It's not the other way around. I feel like logic reads the matrix and all of these things. I think all of them become a really important point of discussion when people fail to realize that a game is meant for you to have an enjoyable experience, not meant for every player to have a 50% win rate. You know what I mean?
It's fun to play uphill. It's fun to play my way. And, some people just want to win, but some people really want to just play it their way. And win or lose, I've at least expressed myself through the choices that I made and through the character that I choose as my avatar. Yeah. And I think that that's the real fun of the game, is that you get to be somewhere else and be someone else and do something else than ordinary life. And whether you win or lose in that is pretty immaterial, as long as you are able to live out the fantasy and experience what the game promised you.
Yeah, and ultimately this is something that I really like pointing out whenever people make custom characters for any of our games. They often come to me with questions of, if I do this attack this way, then if this character fights against characters B, C, Q, and X, he's gonna lose a lot more often. And then I'm going like, but isn't that the point of your character? If you normalize your characters such that they have even matchups against literally everything, what's special about them? What's left? Right? You have to make those concessions in order to give your characters awesome strengths that set them apart. Otherwise, you just have normal man, and I have 50% win rate against every character. Sure, but you're boring, you know?
There's no point to a character that is going to be perfectly balanced if it's not interesting to pilot them.
Yeah, and it's really hard to make a character who's perfectly balanced, and make them interesting at the same time.
It's good to have targets, and balance is a metric, but it's not a goal.
Oh, that's so important, because balance only serves to do one thing. Make sure that the game's still fun for both players. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. That's really all it's meant to do. It's not the goal of the game. The goal isn't to reach perfect balance. The goal is that it's balanced enough so that people can still have fun. Because if the game's completely imbalanced, then nobody has fun, because one guy just plays...
If it's imbalanced, nobody has fun. But if it's too balanced, nobody will have fun either.
Yeah.
But anyway, we could ramble on about this, and it's material that I think we've covered in other episodes, but we could cover in many more. But for tonight, I'm ready to go eat some curry, so I'm going to call it, and we'll wrap this podcast up.
All right. Brad, thank you so much for being with me on this wonderful episode, and thank you, listener, for being on this wonderful episode. Hopefully you made the read that Brad was about to end the episode, because I surely did. So, without much else to say, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the New Level Cap Podcast. As usual, it has been me, your host, Marco DeSantos, also known as Mechanic Rick, and with me has been my Logic Reedy Boy co-host,
Brad Talton, the president of Level 99 Games. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us ramble on and to hang out with us here once more. We will see you next week. Same Level 99 channel, same Level 99 time.
All right.
Thank you all, World of Indians. Thank you,
and good night.
And don't forget your Switch style.
And happy gaming.
The New Level Cap Podcast is produced by Level 99 Games. Join us next Wednesday for more design talk and shenanigans. Thank you for listening.